Quote, "Listen to them, the children of the night, what music they make." End quote. Bram Stoker, Dracula. Part 1. The first testimony of Alex Haines. Thursday, the 31st of August. Up until then, we had had a nice, quiet holiday. Laura, Samantha, Grant, Stuart, and myself. We were not the kind of people to go to the beach. It's far too hot, and there isn't much worth doing, so we had opted to spend a week in the northern reaches of Germany. We were somewhere north of Hamburg, quite a remote location. It was a reasonable but not lengthy drive to the nearest town, and from the driveway there was a lengthy dirt path up to our cabin. There we stayed. We took in walks and drives and visited local attractions, and it was all rather relaxing for the likes of us. We had arrived the Saturday before, and we were now coming to the end of the week. By now we had been running out of things to do, so we decided to have a movie night. We wanted to have all the usual things, popcorn, crisps, drinks, and other snacks, but we hadn't realised how much we had run out of those kind of things, so one of us had to go out and fetch some more. That was no bother. It was relatively light and it wasn't too far, but this is where I can now safely say that it all began. We sent Grant out about 7 o'clock. It was about 20 minutes into the town, about 10 to 20 minutes collecting the things, and then 20 minutes back again. We figured he should be back around 10 to 8, so we waited. We all became really concerned around 8:30. Grant had been gone for too long now. We all thought of where he could be. We reasoned that if he was caught up anywhere, it would be in the town. Something must have happened. We could have tried calling him, but of course, no signal. Stuart and I went out and stood on the decking at the front of the cabin to see if he was coming, but no one came. By now, it had really started to get dark. Soon, the dirt path leading to our cabin was lost to view. It was at this point Laura began to worry. She knew that trying to get from the car back up to the cabin in the dark would be difficult, so I offered to go out with a torch and wait for the car. A few minutes later, with a powerful torch from the cabin, I made my way down the path. It seemed more treacherous in the dark. Thankfully, I not only had the torch, but a full moon shone above me, but I couldn't help thinking something was moving around me. I mean, it was now night time. All sorts of nocturnal animals would be out. My only hope of scaring them off would be my torch. As I arrived at the bottom of the path, I was surprised to find our hire car parked up at the top of the driveway. I shone the torch to see if Grant was inside, but no. I did a proper search and saw a shopping bag on the passenger seat, but no Grant. Anxiously, I quickly made my way back towards the cabin. I couldn't understand where Grant had got to. If he had got out of the car, he would have passed me. I shone the torch towards the cabin as I approached. My heart seemed to throb with anxiety as I caught the silhouette of someone staggering up the steps towards the door. My senses, now on high alert, soon recognised it as Grant. As he collapsed against the outer wall, I heard the scared reaction of the others inside. I shouted, "Quick, get out, help me!" Grant was sat upright against the wall. He seemed to be out cold, fainted perhaps. I shone the torch. That's when I noticed part of the right leg of his trousers had been torn away, and he appeared to be bleeding badly. As the others came out, I quickly told them to help me bring him inside. Stuart helped me carry him in, and soon Samantha began tending to his wound. Thank God she had basic first aid training. She cleaned up the wound as best as possible and bandaged it up. We managed to get Grant into his room and onto the bed. There were a few minutes where he was awake. We tried to find out what happened to him, but after giving him something to drink, he quickly fell asleep again. Samantha was worried. She seemed to think that he had some sort of shock, possibly brought on by whatever he had done to cause that horrible cut on his leg. Friday, 1st of September. None of us really slept well that night. We were all up and down checking in on Grant, discussing with each other what he had actually done to himself. And not just that, we were worried about something else. None of us could put our finger on it, but we felt very unsafe in our cabin. After dozing our way through the night, we found it was now morning. We didn't know what to do that day. We'd had some ideas for what we wanted to do. We only had that one day left of our holiday. We didn't know if we should get Grant to a hospital or at least to a doctor of some sort, or just hope that he was okay and travel back home the following day. We were having breakfast when we heard Grant call out from his room. All of us instantly rushed in to check up on him. He said he wasn't in any pain, but when he tried moving around, his leg still hurt quite badly. Other than that, he was fine. No signs of shock, but equally no recollection of what had occurred that night. An hour or so went by, and after some more medical attention to his leg, he was shuffling around the cabin. We decided to take an easy day, get packed and ready for the journey back. Stuart and I decided to check on the car. We found it parked, but unlocked. There were no signs of a struggle, and all in all, nothing suspicious. As midday rolled around, Grant started complaining about a headache. He took some ibuprofen, but said he couldn't shift it. He then decided that the best way to get rid of it was to sleep it off. He did wake up a few times, and did manage to help us pack, but he kept complaining that his headache would just not go away. Saturday, 2nd of September. We all got up early. We wanted an early start as we had a plane to catch, and we had a hire car to drop off. Thankfully, packing the day before meant we weren't in too much of a rush to leave. Nevertheless, we were all ready to go, except Grant, who took an exceptionally long time getting ready. His headache from the previous day had not gone away, and now, from what he told us, was more like a bad hangover. We managed to vacate the cabin and get into the car. Stuart opted to drive. Samantha and myself stayed in the back with Grant having the window seat as he looked to me that he could throw up at any moment. It was a long drive to the airport. Grant dozed through it, occasionally waking up and gagging. Fortunately, he didn't bring anything up, much to the relief of all of us in the back. We arrived at the airport and Stuart went to drop off the car. We all got out and made our way into the terminal. By now, Grant was struggling to put one foot in front of the other. We were concerned that we wouldn't be able to leave with him on the flight. He did manage to pull himself together long enough to appear well in front of the airport staff. Stuart rejoined us, and we were soon on our way through security. Everything ran smoothly, the plane wasn't delayed, we had no trouble boarding. However, once on the plane, Grant became dead to the world for the entire duration of the flight. We had trouble waking him up as we prepared him for landing, but we managed. We soon arrived at Birmingham and were out into the fresh air. It was now just a simple case of getting the train back home. By now, Grant was almost totally incapable of walking. We must have looked incredibly suspicious getting him on the train, but we managed to navigate the suburbs of Birmingham until we arrived at our block of flats. Stuart, Grant and I shared a flat together. Laura and Samantha shared a flat that was 2 floors down from us. We got in, and Grant instantly made for his bed and went to sleep. We could all now finally relax and take stock of the situation. Grant had become really unwell and we needed to get it sorted, but of course, who knew what was really going on? Sunday, 3rd of September. It was nice waking up in my own bed again. I got on with my usual morning routine, how quickly you sink back into it after being on holiday. Grant was surprisingly up and about. He'd woken up with a dull headache, but had managed to stave it off with some ibuprofen. Everything seemed quite normal. Samantha and Laura had come up to visit us and to check on Grant's wound. It had healed up quite well. It had bruised quite badly though, but the cuts were on the mend. We once again tried asking Grant what he remembered about the night, but he was still unable to recall. It wasn't long, however, before he soon felt tired and decided to turn in. This was strange as it was about mid-morning when this happened. We just figured he was recovering. A few hours later, and he was awake again. Stuart and I were just chilling. We were on our PCs playing various games. I happened to notice Grant rubbing his eyes. When I asked if he was alright, he told me everything was a little blurry. I found it a little concerning, but Grant insisted he was alright. However, an hour hadn't passed and he was already going back to bed. He finally managed to wake up mid-afternoon, and he spent the day playing with us and having dinner. We decided to put on a film. It was quite early as Stuart was back in work the next day. Grant and I were fortunate to have another week off. About halfway through the film, Stuart and I had noticed Grant had fallen asleep again. At the time we found it quite funny, but he was clearly suffering from something more serious than what we had realised. Before going to bed, we made sure he was comfortable, and we even gave him a blanket. Monday, 4th of September. The first Monday back for Stuart came round. He got up reasonably early, did his usual morning routine. Grant and I both got up just as he was getting ready to leave. Grant seemed fine that day. He was hobbling around a bit, but apart from that, seemed fine. I wanted to go into town, visit a few shops. I asked if he'd like to join me, and so we both went off into town. Stuart had taken the car, so we went in by train. We had a fairly pleasant day. Town was much the same as it was. We were heading back on the train. As we took our seats, I noticed Grant seemed to become very tired again. His head kept nodding as if he was trying to stay awake. I shouldn't have laughed, but at one point he did manage to bang his head against the window. By the time we got back to our flat, he was complaining of a headache again. He spent the rest of the day napping. Stuart seemed concerned when he got back from work, but I told him that Grant had been alright until we came home. Tuesday, 5th of September. The next day, things took a turn for the worst. Grant had continued napping on and off, but after Samantha had come round to check on him, she decided it was time to take action. We phoned 111, the non-emergency number, and explained that Grant was showing all the basic symptoms of a fever. The person on 111 said we had to keep him hydrated, give him ibuprofen when dosage is allowed, and sponge him down with tepid water. It sounded like the most old-fashioned treatment I had ever heard of, but we got on with it. Over the course of the day, Grant's health seemed to roller coaster up and down. He would tell us to leave him as he felt better, and then be up on his feet walking around. And then just as quickly he'd be feverish again. Wednesday, 6th of September. Samantha decided to spend the night in our flat. Grant's roller coaster health conditions bothered her. I gave up my bed for her and slept on the settee in the living room. Everyone must have been sound asleep. I certainly wasn't. I stirred at one point in the night and something caught my attention. Something was standing in the doorway, dead opposite the foot of the settee. I lay there and tried to pretend I hadn't seen it. My head was rushing with 100 possibilities of what it could be. I opened my eyes again to take a better look. There was definitely something standing in the doorway. I sat up with confidence, hoping it was just my imagination. After all, I couldn't go back to sleep. It wasn't my imagination. The figure slowly stumbled and hobbled into the room. By now, I was ready to run in panic, but then I noticed it was Grant. "Grant?" I said, but he didn't respond. I got up from the settee. His eyes were closed, and he seemed to be sleepwalking. Stupidly, I shook him and called out his name again. With great force, he swung and pushed me aside. He yelled as he did so, prompting everyone to wake up. Stuart and Samantha quickly rushed into the room. They seemed shocked by what they saw. I quickly reassured them that it had been my fault, but Grant was just as surprised as they were when I told him about the sleepwalking. Thursday, 7th of September. This was a horrible day. Grant was restless and anxious. I kept asking him exactly what the matter was. He couldn't put his finger on it, and eventually he snapped at me for asking. Samantha fetched her blood pressure reading machine. I didn't really understand the readings, but they were bad. His blood pressure had risen very high and was possibly leading towards a heart attack. He didn't seem to be comfortable anywhere, sitting in the living room, lying on his bed, standing outside. It was impossible for him. I really did feel sorry for him. I couldn't imagine then what he was going through, but he was clearly having some form of anxiety attack. Samantha and I pondered on what to do next. We tried phoning his doctors. No luck. Booked up for a fortnight. We thought about dialing 999, but we figured they probably wouldn't rush out. We eventually tried 111 again and asked for advice. The best they could give us was to see his doctor. Samantha brought in a stethoscope, and we both had a listen to his heart. It was racing. Going into the night, Grant was still restless. In the end, we both decided enough was enough. He needed to go to A&E. I went to fetch him and tell him to get dressed, and that's when things started to get weird. He simply refused. I was a little perplexed at his response. I'd known Grant for a while, and didn't know of any fears he had about hospitals. I asked again, but got the same response as last time. By now, Stuart was getting involved, but it just wasn't working. I was tired, so was Stuart and Samantha. His refusal to come had broken me, and I decided to use some force. This is when we first became aware of some serious mental issue that seemed to be affecting him. Now we tried to be reasonably gentle in our persuasion, but he was the one that turned violent. He managed to throw both Stuart and I to the ground. He even raised his voice on the matter. Eventually we backed down and decided to leave him in his room. This incident had scared Samantha somewhat. She decided to return to her flat with Laura. Stuart and I sat in the living room, while Grant paced ferociously around the flat. Friday, 8th September. We were now a week into this ordeal. Grant was still as stressed out as ever. He kept mumbling to himself. I was getting just as stressed out about this situation. I raised my voice and asked what he wanted. To my surprise, he suddenly switched and calmly responded with, "I'd quite like to go for a walk in the woods." This sudden change in attitude shocked me a little bit. The past few days had been a slow descent into maddening anxiety, not just on Grant's part. But his calm request to go for a walk seemed to me like a good idea. We took a wander and found ourselves in the nearby woods. Grant seemed incredibly tame now, and so I asked him how he felt. His response was he felt good. He enjoyed the feel of the air on his face, the smell of the outdoors, the wind in the trees. It was like a great burden had been lifted from him. But then it got weird. I didn't notice it at first, but Grant had started to walk a bit faster. I was struggling to keep up with him. Then, without warning, he broke out into a jog. I jogged alongside. I was starting to get hot. I asked him what the deal was. His answer was strange. He just said, "I want to run. I want to feel myself running with the breeze. Come on, join me." Then he began to run, like proper run. I'd never known him to move this swiftly before. It wasn't a sprint, it was like he was letting himself go with the wind. I struggled very hard to keep up. He kept on running, and suddenly discarded his jacket. I scooped it up from the ground and shouted out to him, but he just kept running. Then he was doing something else I couldn't quite see, but then I saw he'd unbuttoned his shirt and was now discarding that too. "No, Grant, what are you doing?" I shouted, but it was no good. It was like a strange frenzy had overtaken him. I summoned all my strength into going faster. I managed to swoop down and catch his shirt before it touched the ground. It then took more effort to finally catch up with him. I managed to get in front and bring him to a standstill. "What's got into you?" I said. "Put this back on." I handed him his shirt. He didn't seem to care about what he was up to, but he seemed to switch again. He put his hand on my shoulder and thanked me for bringing him outside. Saturday, 9th of September. The following day, we all decided to go for a walk. I had warned the others in private about Grant's run the day before. Samantha found it particularly strange, given the fact that he had been quite badly injured a week before. After a while, Grant began his run again. This time, we all tried to keep up, but he wasn't as quick this time at removing his clothes. But suddenly he froze. We all caught up with him and asked what the matter was. He ignored us and stooped down, placed his hands on the ground in front of him and started sniffing. We all looked at each other confused. Then suddenly he began to try and run on all fours. We were all surprised by this strange attempt to run like this. It just didn't seem normal. Even if he was playing the fool, which every one of us has done, this was just outright crazy. Eventually we saw a dog on the path. Grant froze as the dog began to bark. Soon the dog's owner came into view. He looked at us suspiciously. The dog stood its ground and continued to bark. Grant responded with a low growl. Laura asked Grant what the matter was, but he just wouldn't respond. He was transfixed by the presence of the dog. The owner called out, "What's wrong with him?" We apologised, as the owner eventually persuaded their dog to pass us. The dog still continued to bark at Grant, however, it tried its hardest to pass by with the widest berth possible. It was as if the dog could see something seriously wrong and was standing its ground, but equally didn't want to attack. When the dog finally went out of sight, Grant seemed to return to normal. We tried asking him what that was all about, but he simply replied that the owner should have kept it on a lead. Once we returned home, Samantha questioned me about what was going to happen, since I would be back at work on Monday and unable to keep an eye on Grant. I told her it would probably be fine. I could promise to take him out later when I got back. What was I thinking? I'd somehow told myself that I was fine with Grant's behaviour today, and that his fever, his headache and his anxiety had cleared themselves up, and been replaced with this. What was it? Animal-like behaviour? I just didn't know it, but things were happening. Strange things. Things that didn't seem to have any logical explanation in the way I, or anyone else for that matter, understood about the world. Sunday, 10th of September. Grant didn't seem to want to go for a walk during the day. Instead, he had confined himself to his room and mostly slept. It was only in the evening he seemed to have more energy. He went to bed the same time as Stuart and I, but in the night I heard him get up. I decided to follow, but quietly, just in case he was sleepwalking again. I wasn't prepared to deal with that. I watched him go into the living room. He wandered over to the curtains, and with an almost theatrical flourish, he drew them open. As the light from the waning crescent moon flowed into the room, I caught a glimpse of something in his eye. He then quietly opened the window. I began to panic, wondering what the hell he was up to. Thankfully, my worst fears didn't come true, as the window only opened about an inch. The cool night air began to seep in, and Grant closed his eyes and took in some deep, slow breaths. He then opened his eyes and just stared at the moon. I didn't know what to do. In the end, I chose not to do anything. I simply backed away slowly and left him to it. After the last sleepwalking escapade and violent outburst, I didn't want to experience that again. Monday, 11th of September. First day back at work. It was a terrible slog. After the day was done, I returned home to our flat to find Stuart pacing up and down with his phone. There was no sign of Grant. I could feel my heart starting to speed up with anxiety. Stuart put the phone down. "Grant's been arrested," he told me. He had just been on the phone to the local police station. It seemed that Grant had decided to go wandering by himself, and in that time he managed to expose himself indecently and harass several people also out walking. This had prompted a call to the police, who promptly arrested Grant and took him in. They'd somehow managed to find out where he lived and contacted us. At least Grant was okay, I thought. However, Stuart had more distressing news. It seemed that Grant's behaviour had become incredibly questionable to the police, and so they had decided to keep him under surveillance for the foreseeable. So Stuart and I decided to pay a visit to the station. After a short drive, we arrived. We explained who we were and were told to sit and wait. Eventually, a more senior officer approached us and explained that a psychiatrist had been sent for, but was currently unavailable until the following day. We tried to make excuses for Grant's behaviour. They assured us that he would be fine, and they would take care of him. Thursday, 12th of September. We tried contacting the police to see if the psychiatrist had any more information. He didn't. Instead, we were left worrying about what to expect when we did hear the news. Wednesday, 13th of September. We were finally contacted by the psychiatrist, who told us the news. It seemed that Grant had spent the last day or so behaving like a wolf. He moved around his cell on all fours. He seemed to curl up, much like a dog when he slept. He was even reported to have been howling in the night. There were times when he seemed to completely switch back to being normal again. It was these brief spells of lucidity that shed some light on Grant's condition. The psychiatrist continued by explaining that Grant had spoken about thinking he was in fact a wolf. He went on to say that this was an uncommon mental condition where people believed themselves to be a type of animal. Wolves happened to be one of the most common. He said it was something to do with the amount of werewolves that appeared in films and television. We were somewhat surprised by this revelation. We hadn't known Grant to have been influenced by that kind of thing. We explained this to him, and he went on to tell us that this kind of mental affliction could be brought on by shock. We then told him about the accident on our holiday and the aftermath. We were scolded about not seeking proper medical attention sooner. He then recommended transferring Grant to a psychiatric unit at some remote hospital in the countryside. I felt there were some terrible parallels to a horror film in this scenario, and oh, how it would end up playing out. Thursday, 14th of September. We received the update that Grant had been moved. A few hours later, and they had successfully moved him. It seemed they had no hassle, as his behaviour was tamer than before. We asked when we could visit, and were told it was probably best to visit the next day, as he would have given him time to settle down. Friday, 15th of September. The drive out to the hospital was long. It was easily an hour's drive. We drove past a pair of ornate gates and down a long avenue towards an equally ornate house. All the vibes of some kind of mental asylum were on show. The house was built in a Gothic style and looked from the outside to be decaying. Inside, and we were pleasantly surprised. It was fairly modern. It had clearly been renovated and brought more in line with a modern hospital than a creepy asylum. We were shown to Grant's room. Grant was surprised to see us. He gave each of us a hug and instantly told us how much he hated the place. Everyone seemed too nice for him. The others and I were impressed with how much of a recovery Grant appeared to have undergone in the simple act of being moved here. After about half an hour, the psychiatrist visited us. He was just as shocked as we were at Grant's miraculous recovery. Taking me aside, however, he did express his fears of a possible relapse. He said how, at face value, things may look promising, but it is incredibly easy to misjudge a patient's mental state. We spent a couple of hours with Grant, and as we were leaving, I took what I now believe was one last glance at the guy I knew as a friend. It had got dark now, and as we got into the car, I noticed how truly bleak the building looked in the dark, moonless night. A dark and fearsome facade that withheld a more loving and caring interior. It was a new moon, and the halfway point of the story. Part 2. The Journal of Dr. Green. Friday, 15th of September. The patient, Mr. Grant Rutherford, arrived at our hospital yesterday. I conducted my study upon his arrival. He didn't seem to be showing any signs of the mental afflictions that I had noted while he was being held at the police station. Following all the necessary paperwork involving the patient's notes, he was led to his room. Up until now, he had shown a very calm and understanding manner about the situation. However, upon the arrival in his room, he instantly remarked, and I quote, "I don't like this place, when can I leave?" End quote. There was a slight passive-aggressive tone to that statement, however, he remained in his room and nobody reported anything else for the rest of the day. He was brought food, which he ate, and in the evening his housemates and friends visited. I decided it was best to explain to them that although he may have a calm temperament now, it might be possible he would relapse very soon. I also recommended that to avoid overwhelming him, only 2 people should visit him at any given time. Saturday, 16th of September. The patient had a very quiet day. He complained once again about hating his surroundings. Around the early evening after dinner, the patient began to show signs of his condition once more. He was licking his arms, trying to effectively groom himself like an animal. There was a brief spell when the patient returned to normal human behaviour. However, around 8 o'clock, the animalistic behaviour returned. He was seen prowling around his room on all fours. The patient then slept, however his sleeping position indicated that he was still behaving like an animal. He was in fact curled up on top of the bed. Sunday, 17th of September. Once again, the patient spent most of the day lucid. It was during the afternoon that I decided to talk with the patient and see if he was aware of his behaviour. Worryingly, his response seemed to confirm a deeper issue than I first thought. At the police station, he revealed to me that he was in fact a wolf. Now he is telling me he is a normal man who is in fact now convinced that he is turning into a wolf. Decisions will have to be made upon treatment. In the evening, his wolf-like behaviour began once more. 2 of his friends visited, however they had very little interaction. They witnessed his behaviour firsthand for a brief moment. I also explained the situation regarding his belief that he was now turning into a wolf. They didn't seem to take the news so well. Monday, 18th of September. I have decided to name the condition of this case Lycanthropy, as it seems to share many similarities with an old-fashioned folk tale of a similar thing. After the past 2 days of study, I can now confirm for definite that the patient has a period of lucidity during the day, which gives way to the lycanthropy at night. The patient's awareness of the lycanthropy has also changed. After discussing the condition with him today, he continues to believe that he is turning into a wolf. However, he is now expressing considerable fear towards the fact. Another factor to note is the patient's sleeping pattern is slowly changing. Monitoring his sleep shows a full and healthy 8 hours of sleep. However, over the course of the days since the relapse, his bedtime has shifted forward about an hour each night, resulting in longer nights and later mornings. I'm led to believe that the lycanthropy is altering his internal body clock to allow that part of his brain to be active for more time. Thursday, 19th of September. We were forced to sedate the patient today. The lycanthropy has seemed to take on a more violent form. The patient, in his lucid state, has become more frightened of his other state, and the hours of sleep have forced him to live in a considerably reduced time during the day. Attempts to wake him first thing in the morning were incredibly difficult, as he seems to sleep heavily. Upon the evening, his mental state switched once again, and the lycanthropic behaviour proceeded. However, upon the appearance of the moon, he began to vocally howl. Upon some research, I have found that the moon tonight was a waxing crescent, and the date of his transfer to our facility was a new moon. This shows an interesting correlation, as the date of the new moon coincided with no lycanthropic behaviour. The violent outburst was unexpected, and thankfully we were able to quickly deal with it. However, I do fear that the correlation with the moon might affect the aspect of the patient's case. Wednesday, 20th of September. Today, we attempted to awaken the patient as early as possible, since his condition seems to show some form of routine. I personally believed breaking the routine would have helped us keep him in a lucid condition for much longer. We tried to wake up the patient at 4 o'clock. This failed, as the patient was in incredibly deep sleep. We were, however, successful an hour later. The patient, in his lucid state, is still showing signs of fear towards his lycanthropic state. However, it seems his fears are more for me and my staff, compared to him. He seems to be under the impression that he could end up causing us some serious harm. I have assured him we will not allow such a thing to happen. His friends paid a visit, however I was forced to turn them away, as his lycanthropic state had once again taken over by the early evening. Thursday, 21st of September. The patient requested a walk outside today. We allowed it. Upon leaving the building, the patient showed an impulse to run. He did not, however, attempt to leave the hospital, but nevertheless the patient began to remove his clothes. This behaviour was noted by his friends to me. We managed to return him to his room before he switched state again. I am, however, keen to explore this state in a larger environment outside. Precautions will have to be made and checks to the hospital's boundary fences to ensure no escape attempt is made. Friday, 22nd of September. In the late afternoon, we allowed the patient outside, in the recreational areas of the site. We had appropriate lights assembled on the roof of the building to ensure that if he left any area covered by the floodlights, we would not lose him. Something worth of note, tonight's moon phase is a first quarter moon. The subject very quickly transferred into his lycanthropic state and began running around the recreational area. His running form on all fours is not practical, and he occasionally seems to return to his running on 2 feet. However, he appears to have a hunched over form while doing so. At around 11 o'clock he did leave the area and was tracked with a searchlight. Security was sent in to retrieve him. This is where the patient turned incredibly violent. Several of the security guards received severe scratches, and he was also reported to have attempted to bite. He was eventually caught at 12:30 and was brought back with some considerable struggle to his room. We made the decision to sedate him. Saturday, 23rd of September. An alarming development occurred this morning as the patient has appeared to not switch back into his lucid state. He was awoken by a member of staff at around 6 o'clock and very violently attacked said member. Security rushed in to quickly sedate the patient, however, sedation has only partially worked. He continues to show wolf-like behaviour. However, he does appear drowsy. The member of staff claims that upon being attacked they noticed what they described as glowing rings in the patient's eyes. Examinations of the patient's eyes show no such physical change. Sunday, 24th of September. The patient has still not reverted back to human behaviour. The sedation technique being used is also showing no positive signs of working, and is instead only keeping the patient in a drowsy state. Monday, 25th of September. The patient was reported as sleeping to me this morning. I waited eagerly to witness his change back to a lucid state, however, no such transition occurred. I am, however, struggling to explain the patient's miraculous physical developments overnight. The patient seems to have now developed more muscle. We cannot say if he has had any increase in weight, and we cannot yet provide any explanation for this physical change. I am now beginning to question my abilities as a psychiatrist towards this case. Tuesday, 26th of September. This case has become impossible. All attempts to restrain and sedate the patient have now failed. For now, he has been confined to his room. I cannot fathom the patient's psychological condition. There seems to be something much more menacing going on, something which I cannot explain. As I have stated in previous entries, I can only hope the patient's condition changes after the full moon. It seems ridiculous to think that what I believe to be a simple mental condition is something much deeper and physical than I imagined. Wednesday, 27th of September. The patient showed signs of fatigue today. The constant wolf-like behaviour and lack of food has caused this. As a patient in my care, I regret to say that taking care of him had become impossible. Our lack of ability in restraining him resulted in the neglect of care, which I deeply regret. But today, I saw something disturbing. The report of a glowing ring in the patient's eyes were passed off as a huge mistake by me. Examination of the eyes showed nothing on the day of the report. However, I managed to get close enough to make a somewhat decent physical examination of the patient. Upon observation, the patient's pupils seem to have dilated beyond their natural limit of the human eye. A yellow ring has appeared within the dilated pupil, and in fact looks very similar to an iris. This unnatural change has terrified me, for I could sense something in those eyes staring at me, something that wasn't human. Part 3. The final testimony of Alex Haines. Thursday, 28th of September. I received a phone call from the hospital not long after getting in from work. It seemed desperate, as it took me a while to get any sense out of the doctor who was talking to me. Finally, I found out that Grant had escaped. He seemed to have been having violent episodes, but had calmed down the previous day. He had spoken to the doctor about something. Then, as the afternoon went on, he went into an extreme rage, and then, somehow, and I don't believe this, he had the strength to break down the door and escaped into the countryside. All four of us decided to rush out. The police were keen to have people who knew Grant to be on the search party. We searched for about 2 hours before we returned to the hospital and allowed another patrol to take over. We then spent the night there. Friday, 29th of September. The day started off very peacefully. There had still been no sign of Grant. We all contacted our jobs and explained our situation. We then spent most of the day on edge at the hospital. Eventually, around the early evening, we were asked if we could go out on patrol once more. This was to be it. This is where fate had its dirty tricks in store. We four began our patrol through the woods. We had each been given a torch. Despite having violent behaviour, no one had thought to tell us what to do if we encountered him, and if he was violent. Soon, the sun had set, and we wandered, practically terrified, through the woods. We called out Grant's name many times, but with no response. Then suddenly, a faint cry. We rushed over to the sound as fast as we could, and there we found him, lying on the dirt, half naked and afraid. Samantha was relieved to see him and wanted to help him, but he quickly threw out his hands and desperately asked us to keep back. This was very different to what we had expected. The hospital hadn't told us much, but we knew to possibly expect violence. But now we heard a terror in Grant's voice, almost as if he was scared something was going to happen to us. Stuart asked him what was wrong. He simply replied that we shouldn't be there and we were in danger. Laura asked, "What from?" And then he replied in the most sinister way possible, "From the beast." And then the horror began to unfold. The full moon appeared from behind the clouds. Grant stood up and came forward and basked in its light. The half-naked form stood tall. It almost didn't look like him, but the moon clearly illuminated his features. It was slightly difficult to make out what was going on, and at first I thought it was simply the shadows from the trees. But Grant's body began to morph. He seemed to grow slightly bigger. His fingers seemed to stretch, and suddenly, in the agony, he fell, hands first, to the ground. The sound of crunching bones under his skin made us cringe in horror. All of us looked away at some point, but soon Grant's form had almost vanished into a new form, the form of a wolf. It stood for a moment with its head looking at the ground as it recovered from its transformation. Then, with almighty power, it rose onto its hind legs and let out an almost deafening howl. All of us were petrified to the spot. Eventually, the mighty beast came down, stared at us, sussing us out, looking for any weakness, as it clearly was preparing for our pursuit. I looked into its eyes. Having witnessed its metamorphosis, I couldn't help but feel a strange connection from what I observed of this beast to Grant, somehow lost within. I stood, hypnotized by the terrifying prospect, until Stuart and the others woke me up and we began to start running. It was tricky to run. The protruding roots of trees threatened to trip us up at every step. Meanwhile, the wolf chased us at an alarming pace. I kept thinking to myself, one of us will be caught soon. It's too fast to outrun. Soon, I proved myself right. The root got in the way of my stride. I flew down onto the floor. I tried to pick myself up and found myself trying to scurry away on all fours. The wolf was behind me now. It slowed down. I managed to flip myself over to see it. It slowly prowled towards me, and I scuffled backwards until I hit something. I remember pain, then nothing more. Epilogue. Saturday, 14th of October. I awoke the next morning at the hospital. Someone had found me and brought me in. Grant was never found. Did he ever change back? I don't know. And I don't think I'll ever know what happened to my friend. As for what we witnessed that night, no one believed us. The psychologist of all people who witnessed Grant's behaviour and saw there was something paranormal going on, now believed he was insane, and in an ironic twist had admitted himself to the very hospital in which he had worked. As for me, I was found unconscious in the woods with a bad injury on my leg. I don't need to tell you what that means for me, but last night answered a lot of questions about what happened to Grant that fateful night. We stayed in a region of Germany that is known for its wild wolves, so no one would suspect that among them were werewolves. Clearly, Grant had the unfortunate chance of meeting one that night, and as a result, fell into the claws of that terrible curse. All through the following month, something grew inside him, a parasite in his mind. He couldn't imagine what it could be, but he lapsed and gave in to its wants. And as a result, he committed his body into acting out its wishes. And then, on the full moon, it finally had its moment to break out of its host, transforming him into his inner beast. But for my sake, I wish I knew what happened next. He never spoke of this. I doubt he had the knowledge of what was happening to him to allow him to have told us. But now I know what happened, and thank God I am more prepared for the inevitable. I wrote this testimony so that you may understand how all this happened, and I release it to you now on this night, the 28th of October, so that you can fear for me. Go and look out of your window now. Go, look up and see the light of the full moon. Even if it is obscured by clouds, it's there. Know that we are both looking up at it and standing in its light. And for what's inside me is now getting ready to come out, for I myself have fallen to this fate.